Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking about 4 masculine archetypes: King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover. Alright, so in this week's video we'll be talking about King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover, which are 4 masculine archetypes, and next week we'll be discussing the feminine counterpart archetypes of Queen, Mother, Wise Woman, and Beloved. Alright, so before we get into talking about these 4 archetypes, let's talk a little bit about what an archetype is first. So an archetype is basically a universal symbol or pattern that is innate to human beings that appears in all cultures and eras. The person who came up with the idea of archetypes was Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and he thought of humanity as having a collective unconscious that's shared by humanity as a whole, and that archetypes are kind of like an organ of the collective unconscious. So in the same way that all human beings have a heart and all human beings have lungs, all people have a collective unconscious that links to the consciousness of all other human beings that have the same psychological organs, and archetypes are part of those psychological organs. And I like to think about archetypes as kind of common skeletons of meaning. Basically the skeleton stays the same in every single era and every single culture, but is often fleshed out in very different ways from culture to culture. So for example, with the warrior archetype, every single society has a warrior archetype, but it might be fleshed out in very different ways. There might be a totally different uniform, or maybe some of the rituals and understanding and types of trainings can be very different for different types of warriors from different cultures and different eras, but still fundamentally it has the same skeletal structure. So there's always going to be this element of discipline with the warrior. There's always going to be an element of aggression and forward movement and reaching a goal. And all archetypes exist within us as a kind of instinctual form of knowing. And when it's the case that we tap into the power of these archetypes within us, they can really influence our personal growth and development and individuation. And we can even tap into certain unrealized potentials by developing a deeper relationship with a particular archetype. So an example from my own life is, let's say when I was in high school, when I was in 9th grade, there was another girl who was in 12th grade that I never really actually had any kind of interaction with, but she very much was an embodiment of the archetype of the artist. And so when I would see the way that she would dress and the artwork that she would make, there was a real inspiration there. And so there was part of me that almost sought to emulate her in a way and kind of saw different things in her that may or may not have been there. But through her, who was an embodiment of the artist archetype, who had really, really strongly integrated that archetype, I was able to start connecting into my own artist archetype that exists in my own unconscious mind. And through that, I was able to develop this kind of like unique style and, different ways of looking at things, being able to see things from different angles. And at the time, I had also had this kind of pop cultural notion about what Leonardo da Vinci's personality would be like. And I would also imagine myself interacting with Leonardo da Vinci and what it would be like to study under him and to ask him questions. And through that, I was also able to tap into the power of this archetype. And so these 2 representations of the artist archetype were really, really helpful for me to tap into my own artistic voice. And we can utilize archetypes this way, if we want to grow ourselves in a particular direction. So with the archetypes that I'll be discussing with you today, these are not just abstract concepts. They're also things that can be used for your own personal growth. And so you can connect to these archetypes through people in day-to-day life that that embody that archetype very strongly, so certain role models that you might interact with on a day-to-day basis. You can also look toward fictional characters that embody this archetype as a means to develop that archetype within yourself. And you can connect to these archetypes through, let's say, role models that you might have in day-to-day life. Like if you see somebody who embodies the warrior archetype very well or the magician archetype very well, you can use them as inspiration. You can also connect with them through fictional characters. You know, if there happens to be a character that embodies a certain archetype that's really calling to you and you really resonate with that character, that can be really, really helpful for tapping into that archetype within yourself. You can also look toward people who are well known for embodying a particular archetype. You know, so for example, like with my discussions with Leonardo da Vinci or my conception of Leonardo da Vinci in my head, I was able to tap into my own archetype of the artist. You know, and it doesn't matter if it's accurate what you're thinking about that celebrity or that famous figure or, you know, whoever it might be. You know, it's more about what it is that you're seeing about yourself through that person as a reflection. And you can basically emulate in some ways these characters and individuals in order to tap into that archetype. And it's basically kind of like stepping into the energy of that person and then seeing what's actually there within yourself. So I wouldn't recommend, you know, emulating them to the point where your own personality goes away, but you want to step into, like, let's say, what that person represents to explore those energies and qualities within yourself. Now, one thing I would mention about archetypes is that, you know, there aren't just people-based archetypes. You know, so we do have the king, the warrior, the magician, lover, the queen, the trickster, things like this, but it's not just people. It's people, places, objects, and any kind of, let's say, system or process that is common to all of humanity. So we could have people-based archetypes like king, warrior, magician, lover. We could have place-based archetypes like the forest and like the ocean and like outer space. We can have objects as archetypes, archetypes like the ring and the mirror and the stone. Or we could have, let's say, common pattern-based archetypes, like, let's say, children playing games on a playground could be an archetype, or sitting down and eating a meal with the community could also be an archetype. And the thing that ties all of these things together as archetypes is that they have a common instinctual meaning across all eras and cultures and have shown up in the artwork and the stories of many, many different cultures. All right, so now that I've explained to you what an archetype is, I'm going to be explaining to you about the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover archetypes. And these are the archetypes that are explored in the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. So in this video, I'm going to be giving their perspective on these archetypes as well as my own perspective on these archetypes as well. So it'll be a combination of the two. So I'll be giving the description of the archetype, the disintegrated forms of the archetype or unhealthy forms of the archetype, and then also how to integrate the archetype for each. But before I get into that, just really quickly, I wanted to let you know that very soon I'm going to have the enrollment open for the Consciousness Workers Club, which is my membership site. On the membership site, I do one live masterclass every month and one live group coaching session. So if you're interested in taking classes with me and interacting with me in those classes, or if you're interested in taking group coaching with me, it'd be a great option. There's also a forum there, so you can interact with other people who are in the group, other people who are kind of like-minded, and all of the master classes and the group coachings, they get recorded, and so you can have access to exclusive content, like going back from the start of the membership site, which started back in July. And so if that's something that you think you might be interested in, I'm going to leave let's say a link down below to where you can sign up on the waiting list. So enrollment will open October 1st and go through October 8th. And so if you sign up there, I'll go ahead and I'll give you reminders and notifications for when the enrollment is open. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into the description of the king archetype. So basically, the king archetype and all sovereign archetypes, you know, like the queen as well, have to do with our sense of personal sovereignty. And the king archetype, because it is a masculine principled sovereign, has to do with the external, whereas the queen has to do with the internal element of sovereignty. So while the queen has to do with kind of the interior of the kingdom, and so in our life, that would be our sovereignty in relation to, let's say, the people that we are close to, our sovereignty in close personal relationships. The king has to do with our ability to show up in the world in more impersonal situations and to exercise our sense of power and sovereignty. So in terms of the archetype, the queen would be more oriented to, let's say, the people who are within the kingdom, so the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and how is she going to create domestic policies that, that serve each of these different constituencies, and, how does she resolve the agenda clashes between these different groups? Whereas the king is more concerned with like foreign policy, and so he would be interacting with other kings from other places, and kind of figuring out how, let's say, that community exists in the broader world. And with the king archetype, there's a strong focus toward influence and leadership and taking responsibility for the impact we have on others. Now, in the book by Moore and Gillette, they say that the king has two main functions, and one of those functions is to basically impose order and to maintain the order of their kingdom. The other is for blessing and, and fertility of the land. So the king being associated with, let's say, if the crops are growing well and things like this. Now, a caveat that I would mention with regard to the king being associated with fertility is that it hasn't always been the case that the king was associated with fertility. So basically, fertility is very much an element of Mother Nature, and so it is a more feminine principled thing. And so it really belongs to the mother archetype, not the king archetype. But the thing is, like, in terms of how things used to be for many, many years, where we saw, let's say, Mother Nature as being the thing that provides us sustenance, whenever it was the case that we started to settle down into more ordered, structured societies with more complex institutions, we saw providence, instead of as coming from nature, as coming from, let's say, those complex institutions and officials like the king. So we began to view the king archetype instead of as being a middleman who structures society in such a way that we're able to get supply chains coming in, that bring things from nature. Instead, we were seeing the king as being associated with nature itself, almost like the king was responsible for good crops, or the king was responsible for the things that Mother Nature was actually doing. And so with the king being associated with fertility, we can take that as a sign psychologically that we've misplaced our connection to nature and to the things that, nature brings to us, and we've now put it through the vector of human society and the way that we typically go about, let's say, getting food and getting water. We go to the store to get water, and we go to the store to get food. We don't pick it off of a tree anymore. And so I think this is why this archetype of the king ended up kind of usurping that power of Mother Nature. And it actually reminds me a little bit of a video that I was watching on YouTube of a woman who had participated in an ayahuasca ceremony. And the ayahuasca had communicated to her to stop shopping at Amazon because it gives a false sense of providence. So basically it's like, instead of thinking about nature as the thing that provides, it's, Amazon, the company, is the thing that provides. And I suspect a similar type of thing has happened here with the king archetype. And there are big problems when the power of an archetype gets misdirected toward another archetype, because with the original archetype, we're going to basically be ignoring and neglecting that archetype in all of its lower analogs. And so basically, we might have a tendency to neglect Mother Nature, or we might have a tendency to neglect our body because we're not seeing that that's actually where we get our sustenance from. We think of society as where we're getting our sustenance from, which is like what the king archetype is associated with. But like you see, food, it doesn't come from society, it actually comes from nature. And so we have to relink sustenance back to the mother archetype, and to recognize that while the king might structure society in such a way that is able to bring us, let's say, surpluses of food, ultimately that food does come from the mother. But the king does have quite a bit to do with order. So if we think about what a kingdom is, you have basically like this quasi-geometric kind of shaped wall that's meant to keep nature out, and that's meant to keep, like, let's say, invading armies out, and then it's meant to create a kind of safe containment for the people within the castle walls. And the king is also associated with ordering principles in general, so he's associated with all of the institutions that exist within the kingdom. So anything that works as a kind of system or an algorithm or an institution tends to be associated with the king archetype. And the king also does have to do with blessing and certification. So if we think about, let's say, an embodiment of the king archetype, it could be, let's say, an institution that gives out accredited degrees and diplomas and things like this. That would be an example of the king archetype through the vector of an institution. Or, we can act as the king archetype whenever we are standing in our own power and we're giving encouragement and blessing to another person. And so encouragement is a really strong element of the king archetype as well. Now, in the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Gillette, for each of these archetypes, they talked about the unhealthy forms of these archetypes. So every archetype has two negative polarities, so where it's either, let's say, a more active negative element of the king archetype, let's say, or a more passive negative element of the king archetype. So I'll be going into the negative forms of the archetypes for each of these. And for the king, it's the tyrannical king and the weakling king. And the tyrannical king has a strong disdain for the weakness in others because of the weakness that exists within him. Ultimately, with each of these polarized forms, the tyrannical king and the weakling king, for example, anybody who, let's say, polarizes into the tyrannical king, they're always going to have an underlying weakness that they are polarizing into the tyrant in order to get away from. The same is true for all of these polarized archetypes. And so because the tyrannical king is in resistance to his own weakness, he seeks to kind of lord over other people who are weaker than him. On the other hand, the weakling king is basically one who abdicates his throne because he acts as a doormat. He lets other people rule over him. He doesn't set the proper boundaries. He doesn't impose the proper order. So if it's the case that the king is responsible for keeping the people of the kingdom safe and contained, the weakling king is the one that can't keep a strong boundary, can't keep the negative outside, can't keep perpetrators to the side. Now, while the tyrannical king rules with an iron fist, the weakling king is the one that hides from his power, the one who abdicates the throne. He's the one who is the doormat that lets others run roughshod over him. And he doesn't possess the assertiveness in order to, let's say, create strong boundaries to keep the people of his kingdom safe. And so because the king has to do with imposing order, boundaries are a big part of that. But the weakling king is the one that feels uncomfortable setting boundaries or just doesn't set boundaries, leaving the people in his kingdom, very, very vulnerable, and leaving himself very, very vulnerable. And in this way, the weakling king almost allows other more tyrannical king kind of characters to step up and usurp his power. He also expects others to take responsibility for him and doesn't take accountability for his own actions. Now, in terms of how the tyrannical king and the weakling king show up in day-to-day life in individual people, we could see with the tyrannical king somebody who is domineering, somebody who tries to take power, or maybe they don't have the jurisdiction to take power. Maybe it's somebody who's very pushy and that tries to influence others in like a really, really strong way, against their will. It could also be somebody who tries to come across as really, really strong and tough when it's really, really clear that they have certain insecurities and vulnerabilities underneath that. Whereas the weakling king might show up in a person who kind of poses themselves as the victim, in victim's mentality, and, somebody who tries to pose themselves as the meek good guy, but in reality they have a more tyrannical king going on in the shadows, where they actually are quite manipulative in certain ways. Now, when it comes to cultivating the healthy king archetype in yourself, it's important to develop the following qualities. One is responsibility for others. Another is strength. The other is accountability for your own actions. It's also important to be humble and to be able to acknowledge one's own weaknesses and to be able to compensate for and round those weaknesses. We'll also want to develop the ability to maintain order in our life. So do we create systems for ourselves, like, to create good habits in our life? Do we keep a nice, tidy, and orderly place? Do we keep things like more chaotic, or do we keep things, kind of more in order? To develop the healthy king archetype, we also have to learn how to step into a leadership role and how to encourage others to be the best that they can be. Now, in terms of the sovereignty element of the king, it's very important for us to be able to speak with conviction, and especially to be able to speak truth with the level of authority that truth actually has. So when we know something to be true, it's important for us not to pose it as an opinion or as, oh, hey, I was just thinking this, or kind of going around it. To be able to just make a clear statement and to say this is true. It's also important to be able to cultivate our ability to see ourselves as a servant to the people who are under our care and who we're responsible to. And we want to be able to also, to the best of our ability, stand up for our own vulnerabilities, but also the vulnerabilities of others. To stand up for the meek is a big part of the king archetype. And finally, we also want to develop very strong boundaries so that we can protect ourselves and others and to keep negativity structured out of our lives. All right, so that was the king archetype, and next we're going to be talking about the warrior archetype. And the warrior archetype very much has to do with having a certain goal or purpose and being able to overcome obstacles to achieve that goal or purpose. So developing a strong vision and the discipline to get there is a huge part of the warrior archetype. The warrior archetype also has the element of being willing to sacrifice themselves and their own comfort in order to achieve something, but is also willing to sacrifice the other if it serves the greater good. And the warrior has a lot to do with our sense of aggression and being able to go into fight mode. Now, fight mode doesn't always mean combat, and the warrior isn't always, about, let's say, going to war. Ultimately, going into fight mode means that some circumstance happens external to us that we don't want to have be the case, some kind of negative circumstance, and then we go into fight mode in order to fix that situation. So the opposite of that is that we just allow negative circumstances to be there without fighting back. But when somebody's in their warrior energy, when they see something that's not going right, they take action to fix that thing. They take action to make a change. And maybe 1% of the time or less, that involves actual physical combat. But most of the time it has to do with going into fight mode in the sense of changing the circumstances, going into some kind of action that actually brings about more power and basically brings about better outcomes. And ultimately, when we're the most effective in the warrior archetype is typically when we're being more strategic and less forceful. So basically, if we're in a situation where, let's say, somebody's going to come and beat us up and we have to basically fight back, that's a good time when we can use the warrior archetype in terms of force. Like, we just have to kind of win the fight in order to reassert our power in the situation. But oftentimes when it comes to something that goes over our boundaries, makes us angry, or if we see some issue in our lives or issue in the greater community, what we can do is we could say, okay, I don't like that, but maybe lashing out with anger isn't going to be the thing that actually makes the change. Maybe I have to be a bit more strategic and think about what it is that I want. What's the outcome I'm looking for, and what steps do I have to follow to get there? And we don't want to get into mission drift. So ultimately there's that phrase that says if you're chasing 2 rabbits, you'll catch none. And so we want to chase only 1 rabbit at a time. So an example would be, let's say that somebody goes, is an actual warrior, and they go to war, and they have the goal of defeating the enemy, but maybe they also have a goal of, like, they want to impress the enemy with their great skills in combat. So they're chasing 2 rabbits, maybe without even realizing it, and they're going to be much less effective than if they're just going there to defeat the enemy. It's the same thing when we're in fight mode and we're trying to make positive changes in our lives or positive changes to something else that we want to create transformation and change in. So we'll want to make sure that we're keeping our focus just toward one goal when we're working with the warrior energy. And so it's very, very important for us to keep our focus on just one thing. So focus is a big part of the warrior archetype. Now, in the book by Moore and Gillette, they talk about the warrior in association with aggression and awareness of death and training for skill and accuracy. Also, they associate the warrior with loyalty to who he is acting in service of. So the positive warrior does not act in service of himself, but acts in service of other people. All right, so the negative forms of the warrior archetype, according to Moore and Gillette, are the sadistic warrior, which is the active negative form of the warrior archetype, and the masochistic warrior, which is the passive form of the negative warrior archetype. Now, with the healthy version of the warrior archetype, they're able to sacrifice self and other for the greater good. But the sadistic warrior only sacrifices the other, and the masochistic warrior only sacrifices themselves. And they don't do it for the greater good, they do it almost out of habit. And the sadistic warrior is one that's looking for weaknesses to exploit and to attack, and it has a deep contempt for anything that it perceives as weak or feminine. The sadistic warrior is one who, like the tyrannical king, looks to dominate over others, and it looks for people to attack who are weaker than himself. So it has this deep contempt for anything that's perceived as weak or feminine or vulnerable, and so it will kind of go on the attack there. And basically, it's very disconnected from its own feelings and its own vulnerabilities, and so when it sees that in someone else, it's like the way that they treat their own vulnerability, they treat other people's vulnerabilities the same way. So it's all about trying to find somebody to basically pick on that's smaller than them. And it starts to take things out on itself. So it doesn't attack the other. The masochistic warrior only attacks themselves. They tear themselves down. And so victim's mentality also comes into play with the masochistic warrior in the way that it does with the weakling king. Now, when it comes to integrating the healthy form of the warrior archetype, it's important to cultivate the following qualities. So one is the positive form of aggression, also having a sense of purpose and a sense of focus, and having the discipline to go toward what our goals are. We'll also want to create a kind of warrior code of principles that we stick to every single time. So consistency is a big part of the warrior archetype. We'll also want to cultivate decisiveness and the ability to be strategic thinkers and to make decisions that are going to benefit us long term and to benefit whatever it is that we're trying to do over the long haul. It's also important for someone who wants to cultivate the healthy warrior archetype to be able to persevere in spite of discomfort and pain, so to be able to overcome obstacles in order to reach a particular goal. And it's very important for the healthy warrior to have a sense of distance and detachment so that we can sacrifice in the case that it serves the greater good. All right, so that was the warrior archetype, and now we're going to explore into the magician archetype. So the magician is one that's associated with magic, alchemy, and illusion. So the magician has a lot to do with having a strong understanding of the external world, and that has sort of almost like very niche secret knowledge that not everyone has. So developing a sense of expertise is a part of the magician archetype. And the magician archetype, as it shows up in movies and different stories, it tends to show up as wizards, warlocks, scientists, inventors, and artists. So all of these have an element of the magician. And part of tapping into the magician is to be able to take the materials of the natural world and to shape and form them and alchemize them into something that's useful to humanity or that's creative. It basically is taking raw materials and turning them into something that's greater than the sum of their parts. So there is a strong association between the magician archetype and inventions and new technology. And this is why the magician is very much associated with the scientist. So we might think, like magicians kind of woo-woo and scientist is really, really down to earth. But ultimately we have to realize that the position that's now called the scientist, some of the proto-scientists were basically alchemists. That's where like the field of science really rose up from. And so even though we would maybe look at that as pseudoscience now, we have to understand that the scientist is sort of an offshoot of the magician archetype. And one of the big parts of the magician archetype is exaltation. So someone who can take base metal and turn it into gold, and taking water and turning it into wine. And it basically is just taking things as they are and bringing them up to the next level, bringing them up to their higher forms. So let's say that we have something like a tree that we've chopped down, and then we can make that tree into a boat. And now we can do all of these things with the tree that we weren't able to do before. Or let's say that we take a bunch of vegetables from the garden and we saute them up and we cook them and we put them together, and now it's this really delicious dish that wouldn't have been as delicious had we not alchemized them in that way. And let's say that we have snow on the ground and now we make a snowman and all of the kids get to enjoy it. And we've like basically created this magic where we've taken the natural world and we've formed it in a way that produces this value for people. And the magician is also one that's associated with creating growth for others. It's oftentimes the magician is kind of like the psychopomp or the guide in a particular thing. So thinking about Virgil in Dante's Inferno, or thinking about like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, or even Merlin, in his role that he played in relation to King Arthur. And so he played kind of like this guiding kind of advisor to King Arthur in those stories. And the magician is also strongly associated with creating illusions in both a positive and negative form. So for example, let's say that there's a politician or a political figure that they angle all their messaging and speeches in a way that doesn't perfectly encapsulate the truth of a situation, because maybe that wouldn't be very enlivening for people. But maybe they structure their message in some way that inspires and ignites people toward positive action. We can also have the opposite thing, where maybe a politician lies about things and misrepresents things in order to froth their constituents into into a lot of fear and a lot of anger, and now those constituents go out and create problems for other people because of that. It's the same type of energy, it's the same type of magician energy, only one is a more positive magician energy and the other is a more negative magician energy. Both use illusion to opposite outcomes. And in the book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Moore and Gillette, they describe the magician as one that possesses special knowledge that others do not know. And so there's this expertise element to it. And that the magician also uses this special knowledge to create new things. They also associate the magician with liminal spaces and to be kind of the wise old man that creates this kind of ritual space for people to connect with the spiritual. Now in the book, the negative polarizations of the magician archetype are the detached manipulator and the denying innocent one. So the detached manipulator is one that basically acts as a trickster kind of character that uses their ability to spin illusions in order to mess with other people's heads, in order to, manipulate them into doing what they want them to do, at the expense of the other person and to their own benefit. Now, with the denying innocent one, there's a lot of manipulation with this archetype too, but the denying innocent one is the one that tries to come across like they don't know anything. So it's the person who plays stupid, it's the person who tries to act naive and innocent to trick the other person. So for example, like when somebody, let's say, hustles somebody that they're playing like pool with or something, they say, oh, I've never played this game before, I have no idea. And, they get the other person to bet a lot of money and then they trick them, and then they basically in the last couple of rounds just run the table, so that would be like an example of the denying innocent one. But with both of these negative polarizations of the magician, they all share the sense of having special knowledge that maybe other people don't, and utilizing that special knowledge to trick and to create illusions for people to fall into. Now, when it comes to integrating the magician archetype, it's very important for us to gain external knowledge. So we want to basically be very curious, we want to be well read, and it's a bonus if we can even get some kind of academic knowledge. So if we're able to get some kind of professional degree, this helps us with connecting to that magician archetype. We'll also want to become proficient in our use of technology and maybe even tap into our ability to invent and create new things. We'll also want to develop a deeper awareness of the natural world and the natural world's secrets. We can do this through the lens of science, but we can also do this through the lens of kind of going out in nature and exploring for ourselves. Both of those help us tap into the magician energy. Another part of the magician energy is the ability to be a mentor or a teacher for another person. And so we'll want to come up with ways to tell stories and to teach our knowledge to others. Along with this, we also want to make sure that we're only teaching the right things to the right people. There are certain things that we'll come across in our pursuit of knowledge as the magician that maybe if you tell it to somebody who's not ready for it yet, or that it's not going to work out for them in some way, if you tell it to them, it might cause more problems than if they didn't know it at all. And so it's important to be able to create barriers to your knowledge when it serves the greater good. And then also being able to create liminal space for yourself or to explore liminal space is important. So getting in touch with things like dreams, which I think of as kind of a liminal space between the conscious and the unconscious mind, can be helpful in this way. Or, basically having a space where you can go to meditate would also be a good way to cultivate the magician archetype. All right, so that's it for the magician archetype, and now let's focus on the lover archetype. So the lover archetype is one that is fundamentally motivated by its passion for life. It feels very, very alive, and it's very, very much about connecting to the sensual pleasures of things, so the taste of food, the feeling of the breeze hitting the skin, the sound of good music, all of these things enliven the lover. And the lover is one that gives love unconditionally, but it doesn't give love unconditionally through sacrifice at all. What it does is it drinks in the fullness of its lived experience so much that its loving cup fills up and totally overflows. And so the lover is one that shines its radiance on other people. Now, this archetype and its feminine counterpart, the beloved, with the lover giving love unconditionally and the beloved receiving love unconditionally, basically they're oftentimes both lumped into a kind of culturally feminine category because we tend to associate with love with the feminine societally. And so basically what ends up happening is that similar to how the mother archetype got kind of usurped into the king archetype, the lover gets kind of usurped into the beloved archetype. And if we think about the highest analog of the lover and beloved dynamic, we can see, let's say, God as like the one that loves infinitely and the one that loves absolutely as the lover, whereas all of us in creation are like the beloved that are the recipients of that love. So that's the highest analog of that. But then we have more human analogs of that, where we play the lover when it's the case that we're giving to charity, or when we are offering someone our encouragement or our energy in some way. When we're in that state of being in service to other people, that's when we've tapped into the lover. And in the book by Moore and Gillette, they describe the lover as the one that seeks connection and oneness with all things, and one who is enlivened by their place in the world, who finds meaning in the passion that they have for life. Now, according to the book, the negative polarities of the lover are the addicted lover and the impotent lover. And the addicted lover is basically one who engages in a kind of addictive sort of hedonism that's always looking for a new flavor of the week, that has this sense of there being a void and is always trying to fill that void with something. Maybe fill that void with food, or fill that void with a new relationship, or fill that void with sex. All of these things are there within the addicted lover. And with the addicted lover, there's also a big energetic issue where they're not able to put their energy in one direction and they're not really able to commit. And so their energy just kind of spills out all over the place. Then the more passive negative pole of the lover archetype is the impotent lover. And this is the person who's not really very in touch with the lover archetype. This is the person that feels like life is a big slog and that, everything is kind of like dull and gray and that there's no joy to really be had. And the impotent lover is very, very disconnected from his heart and very, very disconnected from his libidinal energy. Now, to be able to get in touch with and integrate the healthy form of the lover archetype, it's very, very important to get in touch with all 5 of your senses. Can you see what you're seeing? Can you feel what you're feeling? Can you hear what you're hearing? And really being able to take things in. Being very mindful, for example, when you eat or when you're listening to music. And, being able to appreciate all of the different things that you're passionate about within those experiences. Another thing that's also important for the integration of the lover archetype is the ability to cultivate an okayness with being. So instead of looking for always the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, to be able to really sit and be present with what is right now and to appreciate all the elements of what is right now. It's also very important to be able to have fun and to enjoy things and to be able to connect with people in your life, like friends and family and romantic partners. It's also essential if you want to integrate the lover archetype to be very, very much in touch with your own emotions, because your emotions are the way that you know that you're enjoying something. If you can't feel your emotions, you can't really feel your passion for anything. You also want to be able to let go and also to be able to cultivate a sense of gratitude for all the little things in your life. Not just the big things, but the little things. All right, so that's it for the lover archetype. So we've, in this video, discussed the 4 masculine archetypes of the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. Next week, we're going to be exploring the feminine counterparts to these, the queen, the mother, the wise woman, and the beloved, which are very, very different from these 4 as well. So I know that like in one resource that I looked up in relation to the book, I know that there was another version where it was just like the only difference was the queen was different. But the feminine archetypes are really quite different, so do check that out if you were interested in this one. And I'll be giving also my interpretations of what the negative forms of these archetypes are, since there's no equivalent book to the king, warrior, magician, and lover. And so do check that out next week. And yeah, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Also, if you would like to get on the waiting list for the Consciousness Workers Club, again, that's going to be opening up the first week of October and the first week of October only for fall enrollment. And so if you want to get on the waiting list, you can click the link in the description box or in the comments section, and you can just put your email down and I'll give you notifications for when enrollment is open. That way you get reminders. All right, so that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.